The old alien sat in the corner of the dark bar, his 4 eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Zexthery had been drinking alone for hours, but the young coalition soldiers had finally worked up the courage to approach him. They wanted to hear the stories. Everyone knew about the human war, but few had actually fought in it. "You want to know about the humans?" Zexthery's voice was rough, like stones grinding together. 3 of his arms were missing, and deep scars covered his reptilian skin. "Sit down, then. But know that once you hear these stories, you will never sleep peacefully again." The young soldiers pulled up chairs around his table. Their faces showed excitement and curiosity. They had no idea what was coming. "The first time I saw humans fight, I thought it would be easy," Zexthery began. "We were told they were primitive, weak. They had only been in space for a few hundred years. How dangerous could they be?" He took a long drink from his cup before continuing. "My unit was part of the first real battle against humans. It was at a mining colony on a planet called Kepler 438b, just a small settlement with maybe 200 humans living there. We brought 12 heavy cruisers. 12? Against 200 miners and farmers." The young soldiers leaned in closer. This sounded like it would be a story about an easy victory. The colony was built on an asteroid field near the planet. The humans had been mining there for about 10 years. When our fleet arrived, we expected them to surrender immediately. Instead, they sent us a message. Zexthery paused, his eyes distant as he remembered. The message was from their security chief, a man named Jake Morrison. He was a former soldier from their military. Do you know what he said to us? He said, "This is our home. If you want it, come and take it." Then he cut the transmission. One of the young soldiers laughed. "That's it? That was their response to 12 warships?" Zexthery's eyes focused on the soldier who had laughed. "You find that funny? Let me tell you what happened next." The laughter died quickly. "We moved in to begin the attack. The plan was simple. Surround the colony, demand surrender, and if they refuse, destroy them quickly. We had done this 1,000 times before with other species. It always worked the same way." Zexthery's claws scratched against the table as he spoke. "But humans don't think like other species. While we were moving into position, they were preparing. Morrison had organized the colonists into fighting groups. A woman named Lisa Grant, who was just a mining engineer, started turning their industrial equipment into weapons. The mining lasers, the drilling equipment, the explosive charges they used to break apart asteroids, she turned all of it into tools of war." The old alien's voice grew quieter, more intense. "The first ship to enter the asteroid field was the cruiser Velmuth. It had a crew of 300. As it moved between the asteroids, the humans activated their mining charges. But they didn't just explode randomly. They had planned it perfectly. The explosions created a chain reaction that sent huge chunks of rock flying at incredible speeds." Zexthery paused to drink again. "The Velmuth's shields couldn't stop asteroid chunks the size of buildings. The ship was torn apart in seconds. 300 souls gone, just like that." But that was only the beginning. The young soldiers were no longer smiling. They began to understand that this was not going to be a story about easy victory. The humans had turned the entire asteroid field into a trap. Every rock, every piece of debris, every mining station was part of their defense. As our ships tried to navigate through the field, they would trigger more explosions. The humans were using the asteroids themselves as weapons. Zexthery's voice became filled with a mixture of respect and horror. But the worst part was not the asteroids. It was the humans themselves. Morrison had organized teams of volunteers to pilot small mining ships in suicide attacks against our cruisers. These were not soldiers. These were farmers, mechanics, teachers, people who had never been in a real fight before. The bar had become completely quiet. Even the other patrons were listening now. I watched through my ship's viewing port as a small human mining vessel rammed directly into the bridge of the cruiser next to us. The pilot was a woman named Lisa Grant, the same engineer who had turned their equipment into weapons. She could have stayed safe in the colony, but instead she flew her ship directly into our guns. Zexthari's 4 eyes closed as he remembered. The explosion destroyed both ships. But before she died, Grant managed to send a transmission to the other human ships. She was laughing. Actually laughing as she flew to her death. She said, "That's 1 down, boys. Make them pay for every inch," one of the young soldiers whispered. She was insane. "No," Zexthari said firmly. "That's what we thought at first. But humans are not insane. They are something much more dangerous. They are willing to die for things they believe in. Not just willing, eager," the old alien continued his story. The battle lasted for 6 hours, 6 hours of hell. The humans used every trick they could think of. They hid fighters inside hollow asteroids. They used their mining lasers to superheat our ship hulls until they cracked. They even sent teams of colonists in spacesuits to attack our ships directly with hand tools. Zexthari's voice broke slightly. "I saw a human child, maybe 15 years old, floating in space with nothing but a mining suit and a bag of explosive charges. She was trying to attach them to our ship's engine. When our gunners shot at her, she didn't try to escape. She just kept working on the charges until the very end." The silence in the bar was complete now. By the time the battle was over, we had won. The colony was destroyed. Every human was dead. But look at the cost. We started with 12 cruisers. Only 3 were still able to fly when it was over. We lost over 2,000 troops. The humans had 200 people total. Zexthari stood up slowly, his remaining arm shaking. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what we found when we searched the ruins of the colony. The humans had prepared for this battle for weeks. They had sent detailed recordings of everything to other human colonies. They wanted other humans to know exactly how we fought, what our weaknesses were, and how to hurt us. The old alien looked directly at each of the young soldiers. Morrison's final message was found in the colony's communication center. He had recorded it right before the battle started. Do you know what he said? He said, "We are going to lose this fight. But we are going to make sure that every human in the galaxy knows how to make these monsters bleed." Zexthari sat back down heavily. That was when we realized the truth. The humans were not just fighting to defend one small colony. They were fighting to send a message to every human in the galaxy. The message was simple: we will never surrender, we will never give up, and we will make you pay a terrible price for every victory. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. This was not the story they had expected to hear. That battle was supposed to be easy, Zexthari continued. It was supposed to show the humans that resistance was useless. Instead, it showed us that we were fighting something we had never encountered before. A species that would rather die fighting than live as slaves. He finished his drink and looked at the young soldiers one final time. And that, my young friends, was just the beginning. The humans had 4 more years to show us exactly how creative they could be when it came to war. Each battle was worse than the last. Each victory cost us more than we ever imagined possible. The old alien stood up to leave, but those are stories for another night. Tonight you have learned the first lesson about fighting humans. They are not stronger than us. They are not smarter than us. They are not more advanced than us. But they are something much more dangerous. They are absolutely, completely, and utterly unwilling to quit. As Zexthari walked away, the young soldiers remained at the table, staring into their drinks. They had come looking for exciting war stories. Instead, they had learned their first lesson about the species that had nearly destroyed the greatest military force in the galaxy. The humans were not just another enemy. They were something else entirely. Something that would haunt the Coalition's nightmares for generations to come. The next night, the young Coalition soldiers returned to the bar. They had spent the entire day thinking about Zexthari's first story. The old alien was already at his usual table, but tonight he looked even more tired than before. "You came back," Zexthari said without looking up from his drink. "I was hoping you would stay away. Some stories are better left untold." The soldiers sat down anyway, They needed to hear more. "The second story is worse than the first," the old alien warned. After the fight at the mining colony, the coalition leaders were angry. They decided to make an example of the humans. They chose a planet called New Geneva. Zex3's claws clicked against the table as he spoke. New Geneva was one of the humans' most important worlds. It had military bases, factories, and over 10 million people living there. The coalition decided to bring the largest fleet we had ever assembled, 300 ships. We thought that would be enough to make the humans surrender without a fight. The young soldiers leaned forward. 300 ships sounded like certain victory. The planet was defended by a human general named Kate Williams. She was old for a human, maybe 60 years, but she had fought in wars before. When our fleet arrived at New Geneva, she sent us a message. Zex3 paused, his eyes distant. Williams said, "You want our world? Come down and take it. But no. That every step you take will cost you blood. Every building you enter will be your tomb. Every human you kill will take 10 of you with them." Then she cut the transmission. One of the young soldiers shifted uncomfortably. "Just words to try to scare you." "That's what we thought too," Zex3 replied. "So we began the siege. We surrounded the planet and cut off all supply lines. No food, no medicine, no weapons could reach them. We waited for them to surrender." The old alien's voice grew darker. "But humans don't surrender." Instead, Williams turned the entire planet into a fortress. Every man, woman, and child became part of the defense. They didn't just prepare to fight our soldiers. They prepared to fight our minds. Zex3 took a long drink before continuing. "There was a human scientist on the planet named Alex Chun. Before the war, he studied diseases and how to cure them. But when the siege began, he started working on something else. He began creating biological weapons that would target our species specifically." The soldiers looked confused. "Biological weapons? Poisons, diseases, chemicals that would kill us but not harm humans," Zex3 explained. Chun had studied captured coalition soldiers from previous battles. He learned about our biology, our weaknesses. Then he created weapons designed to exploit those weaknesses. The old alien's voice became filled with disgust. "The humans put these weapons in their water supply. When our troops landed on the planet, they needed water to survive. But every drop they drank was slowly killing them. The poison worked slowly, so our soldiers didn't realize what was happening until it was too late." Zex3's eyes closed as he remembered. "I watched good soldiers die in agony, not understanding why their bodies were failing them. The humans had turned the very water we needed to live into a weapon against us." The bar was completely quiet now. Even the bartender had stopped working to listen. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what they did to our minds. There was a human special forces soldier named Steve Collins. He led teams of volunteers on suicide missions against our ships. Zex3's voice dropped to a whisper. Collins and his teams would sneak onto our ships at night. But they didn't come to gather information or steal weapons. They came to break our spirits. They would sabotage our life support systems, leaving us to die slowly. They would leave recordings of human laughter playing in our quarters. They would put pictures of our dead comrades in places we would find them. The young soldiers were starting to look sick. The psychological warfare was designed to drive us insane. Collins studied our culture, our fears, our superstitions. Then he used that knowledge against us. He knew that my species fears the dark, so he would cut power to sections of our ships. He knew that other species fear certain sounds, so he would play those sounds through our communication systems. Zex3's claws dug into the table. But the most horrible thing Collins did was send us volunteers. Living humans who would surrender to our forces, claiming they wanted to defect. Our commanders would interrogate them, trying to learn about human defenses. But these volunteers were not really defecting. They were suicide bombers. The old aliens? Voice became filled with horror. These humans had surgically implanted explosives in their bodies. When they were brought before our commanders, they would detonate themselves. But they didn't just want to kill our leaders. They wanted to destroy our morale. Zex3 looked directly at the young soldiers. Before they died, these volunteers would tell our commanders exactly how many more humans were coming. They would describe in detail what they planned to do to us. They would laugh as they told us about friends and family members who had volunteered for similar missions. The silence in the bar was so complete that everyone could hear their own heartbeats. The siege lasted 8 months. 8 months of hell. Our soldiers began to break down mentally. They were afraid to eat, afraid to drink, afraid to sleep. They knew that every shadow might hide a human assassin. Every sound might be another psychological attack. Zex3's voice cracked with emotion. I watched brave soldiers start to hurt themselves rather than face another day of the siege. Some refused to leave their quarters. Others begged to be sent home. Many simply stopped fighting and waited to die. The young soldiers were staring at their drinks, unable to look at the old alien. The humans never tried to break out of the siege. They never asked for help from other human worlds. They just kept fighting, day after day, making us pay for every small victory. Williams had organized the entire population into a war machine designed to destroy us from the inside. Zex3 stood up slowly. Do you know what the worst part was? The humans could have escaped. They had ships hidden on the planet. They could have evacuated their people and fled to other worlds, but they didn't want to escape. They wanted to make us suffer. The old alien walked to the window and looked out at the stars. After 8 months, the coalition commanders decided to retreat. We had started with 300 ships and over 50,000 troops. When we left New Geneva, we had less than half our ships and barely 20,000 soldiers who were still able to fight. Zex3 turned back to the young soldiers. The humans had won. They had faced the largest military force in coalition history and driven us away, but they paid a terrible price. The planet was in ruins. Millions of humans had died. Their cities were destroyed, but they had accomplished their goal. The old alien returned to his seat. William sent one final message to our fleet as we retreated. She said, "Tell your leaders that this is what happens when you attack human worlds. Tell them that we have 100 worlds just like this one. Tell them that we will never surrender, never retreat, and never forgive." Zex3 finished his drink and looked at the young soldiers. That was when the coalition leadership realized the truth. The humans were not just defending their territory. They were teaching us a lesson. They were showing us that conquering human space would cost us everything we had and more. The old alien prepared to leave. New Geneva was rebuilt after the war. It's now one of the most heavily fortified worlds in human space, but we never attacked it again. We learned that some victories are too expensive to win. As X3 walked away, the young soldiers remained at the table. They had learned another terrible lesson about humans. They would fight not just with weapons, but with their minds, their bodies, and their very souls. They would turn everything around them into a weapon, including themselves. The humans were not just dangerous because they refused to surrender. They were dangerous because they understood that sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy afraid to fight it. On the third night, Zex3 was already drinking when the young soldiers arrived. His hands were shaking more than usual, and his 4 eyes kept darting toward the shadows in the corners of the bar. "You shouldn't have come back," he said without looking at them. "Tonight's story is the worst one. After tonight, you'll understand why we stopped fighting the humans." The soldiers sat down anyway, though they were beginning to regret their curiosity. After New Geneva, the coalition decided to try a different approach. Instead of attacking human colonies, we would target their military stations. We thought that if we could destroy their ability to fight, they would have to surrender. Zex3's voice was barely above a whisper. We chose a target called Proxima Station. It was humanity's last major military base in the outer systems. Just one space station, but it controlled shipping routes for dozens of human worlds. The coalition assembled our largest fleet, yet 1,000 ships. The young soldiers looked impressed, despite themselves. 1,000 ships seemed like enough to destroy anything. The station was commanded by a human named Beth Taylor. She was young for a commander, maybe 40 years old. When our fleet arrived, she didn't even try to negotiate. She just activated something called the Berserker Protocol. Zexthery stopped talking and stared into his drink for a long moment. "What's the Berserker Protocol?" one of the soldiers finally asked. The old alien looked up with haunted eyes. "It's something that still gives me nightmares. The humans had discovered that they could modify their own brains. They could surgically remove the parts that feel fear, pain, and the desire to stay alive. But they kept the parts that feel anger and joy." The soldiers looked confused. Why would they do that to themselves? "Because they created the perfect soldiers," Zexthery said. "Humans who felt happiness when they killed enemies. Humans who felt joy when they died fighting. Humans who had no fear of death and no desire to retreat." The bar had become completely silent again. There was a young human officer named Carl Anderson. He was maybe 25 years old. He had a wife and a baby daughter back on Earth. When Taylor activated the Berserker Protocol, Anderson was the first to volunteer. Zexthery's claws scraped against the table. I watched through our ship's sensors as Anderson went into the medical bay. When he came out 30 minutes later, he was still human on the outside, but something inside him had changed. His eyes were different. They were filled with a terrible joy. The old alien's voice became filled with horror. Anderson and 49 other volunteers climbed into small fighter ships. These were not normal fighters. They had been modified to be used as weapons. The humans had removed all the safety systems, all the life support backups, all the ejection seats. These ships were designed to be crashed into enemy vessels. Zexthery stood up and walked to the window. But the worst part was not the ships, it was the pilots. I could see Anderson's face through his cockpit window as he flew toward our fleet. He was smiling, actually smiling as he prepared to die. The young soldiers were starting to look sick. The Berserker pilots didn't just fly suicide missions. They flew impossible missions. They would thread their ships through weapons fire that should have killed them instantly. They would attack targets that were supposed to be unreachable. They would accomplish things that violated every law of physics and common sense. Zexthery turned back to the soldiers. Anderson's target was our command ship. It was protected by 50 escort vessels and the most advanced shields in the Coalition fleet. Getting close to it should have been impossible for a single fighter. The old alien's voice dropped to a whisper. But Anderson didn't just get close. He danced through our defenses like they weren't there. He destroyed 6 escort ships on his way to the command vessel. When he finally reached it, he didn't just crash into the hull. He flew directly into the bridge, killing the admiral and his entire staff. Zexthery sat back down heavily. But that was just one pilot. There were 49 others, and they were all just as impossible to stop. They would target specific parts of our ships to cause maximum damage. They would aim for life support systems, leaving our crews to die slowly. They would hit communication arrays, leaving our ships isolated and afraid. The old alien's voice became filled with disbelief. The most horrifying thing was their precision. These pilots were flying suicide missions, but they were doing it with perfect accuracy. They would disable our weapons without destroying our ships, leaving us helpless to fight back. They would breach our hulls in exactly the right places to cause panic among our crews. Zexthery looked directly at the young soldiers. There was a human scientist named Nina Roberts who had developed the Berserker Protocol. She had studied human psychology for decades. She discovered that humans had always been capable of going into battle rages where they felt no fear and no pain. She just found a way to make it permanent. The soldiers were staring at their drinks, unable to look at the old alien. Roberts had created something that wasn't quite human anymore. These pilots felt genuine happiness when they killed enemies. They felt pure joy when they died in battle. They had become living weapons that enjoyed their own destruction. Zexthery's voice cracked with emotion. I watched 50 modified humans destroy nearly 200 coalition ships. 200 ships with crews of thousands each. And the Berserker pilots were laughing the entire time. Actually laughing as they flew too. Their deaths The bar was so quiet that everyone could hear the old alien's labored breathing. The battle lasted only 4 hours. When it was over, Proxima Station was destroyed and all 50 Berserker pilots were dead. But they had accomplished their mission. Our fleet was shattered. The survivors were too traumatized to continue fighting. Zexthery stood up again, his remaining arm shaking. But the worst part came at the end. Commander Taylor sent a final transmission to our surviving ships. She told us that the Berserker Protocol was not new. She said that humans had been going into battle rages for thousands of years, long before they reached the stars. The old alien's voice became filled with terror. Taylor explained that what we had just witnessed was not some new weapon. It was just the latest version of something humans called going berserk. She said that human warriors had been doing this since before they discovered fire. They had been perfecting the art of controlled madness for their entire history. Zexthery walked toward the exit. That was when we realized the truth. We were not fighting a species that had learned to be violent. We were fighting a species that had been born violent. The humans had not developed weapons of war. They had developed ways to control their natural instincts for destruction. The old alien paused at the door. The Coalition fleet retreated immediately. After that battle, we had learned that humans were not just willing to die for their beliefs. They were capable of modifying themselves to become living weapons. They could turn their own minds into tools of war. Zexthery looked back at the young soldiers one last time. After that day, Coalition commanders began to understand that we were not fighting a normal war. We were fighting a species that had evolved to be perfect warriors. Every human was a potential berserker. Every human was a potential weapon of mass destruction. The old alien opened the door to leave. The humans never used the Berserker Protocol again after Proxima Station. They didn't need to. We had learned our lesson. We had seen what they were, capable of when they stopped holding back their true nature. As Zexthery disappeared into the night, the young soldiers remained at the table. They had learned the most terrifying lesson yet about humans. They were not just determined fighters or clever tacticians. They were a species that had been designed by evolution to be perfect instruments of war. The humans had shown the Coalition that they could modify their own minds to become living weapons. They had proven that they could turn their greatest strength, their humanity, into their most terrible weapon by choosing to abandon it completely. The fourth night, Zexthery was not at his usual table when the soldiers arrived. They found him standing outside the bar, staring up at the stars. His 4 eyes were wide with fear, and he was muttering something under his breath. "Are you all right?" one of the young soldiers asked. Zexthery turned to look at them, and they saw that his eyes were filled with tears. "I was remembering Europa," he said quietly. "I was remembering the ghosts." The soldiers followed him back into the bar. Tonight, Zexthery ordered the strongest drink available and drank half of it before speaking. After Proxima Station, the Coalition leadership was desperate. We had lost thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of troops. They decided to try attacking a place that had special meaning to humans. They chose Europa. The old alien's voice was shaking. Europa was humanity's first colony outside their home system. It was built on an ice moon that orbited a gas giant. The humans had lived there for over 300 years. To them it was sacred ground. Zexthery took another drink before continuing. The Coalition assembled a ground invasion force. 50,000 troops with the best equipment we had. We thought that if we could capture Europa, the humans would finally understand that they could not win this war. The young soldiers leaned forward. A ground invasion sounded different from the space battles they had heard about. The invasion force was led by General Kexmuth, one of our finest commanders. When our ships arrived at Europa, we expected to find heavy resistance. Instead, we found nothing. Zexthery's claws clicked nervously against his glass. The cities were empty. The military bases were abandoned. The factories were shut down. It looked like every human on the moon had simply vanished. Our sensors showed no life signs anywhere on the surface. The old alien's voice dropped to a whisper. General Kexmuth ordered the troops to land and search for the missing humans. We thought they had evacuated to other worlds. We thought we had won an easy victory. We were wrong. Zexthury stood up and began pacing around the table. The human commander on Europa was a colonel named Don Murphy. We found his final official report in the abandoned command center. He had ordered the evacuation of all civilians. But he and his military forces had never left the moon. The soldiers looked confused. Where were they hiding? Everywhere and nowhere, Zexthury replied. Murphy had taken his troops underground. Europa has thousands of tunnels and caves beneath its surface. The humans had turned the entire moon into a maze. The old alien's voice became filled with dread. At first, everything seemed normal. Our troops searched the empty cities and found nothing dangerous. But then strange things started happening. Equipment would malfunction for no reason. Lights would flicker on and off. The temperature in some areas would drop suddenly. Zexthury sat back down and leaned forward. Then soldiers started disappearing. Not in groups, not during battles. One by one, when they were alone or separated from their units, they would just vanish without a trace. The young soldiers were starting to look nervous. General Kexmuth thought it was equipment failure or accidents. He ordered stricter safety procedures, but the disappearances continued. Every day, more soldiers would vanish. And then we started finding the bodies. Zexthury's became barely audible. The strange thing was how they died. There were no weapon wounds, no signs of violence. The medical examiner said they had died of heart failure. But these were young, healthy soldiers. They should not have died that way. The bar had become completely silent again. That's when we realized we were being hunted. There was a human sergeant named Amy Foster who led a small team of soldiers. They had never left Europa. They were living in the tunnel systems, moving through the underground passages like ghosts. Zexthury's eyes darted toward the shadows in the corners of the bar. Foster's team would appear just long enough to eliminate isolated coalition soldiers, then disappear back into the tunnels. But they weren't just killing our troops. They were terrorizing them. The old alien's voice cracked with fear. There was a human psychologist named Kevin Ward who had designed their tactics. He had studied every coalition species for years. He knew exactly what frightened each of our races. Then he used that knowledge to create targeted nightmares. Zexthury began shaking uncontrollably. My species fears the dark and cold. So the humans would cut power to areas where my people were stationed. They would disable the heating systems, making the rooms as cold as the space between stars. They would play sounds in the darkness, footsteps, breathing, whispers in languages we didn't recognize. The young soldiers were staring at the old alien in horror. Other species had different fears. The humans learned about all of them. They would create customized terrors for each group of soldiers. Some species fear certain colors, so the humans would paint symbols on walls that only appeared under specific lighting. Other species fear particular sounds, so the humans would play those sounds through damaged communication systems. Zexthury's voice became filled with panic. But the worst part was what they did to our minds. Soldiers would start seeing things that weren't there. They would report dead comrades walking through the corridors. They would hear voices calling their names from empty rooms. The old alien grabbed his glass with shaking hands. The humans had studied our psychology so carefully that they knew exactly how to make us doubt our own senses. They would move objects when we weren't looking. They would leave messages in our own handwriting that we didn't remember writing. They would create situations that made us question our own sanity. Zexthury stood up abruptly and walked to the window. My own unit began to fall apart. Soldiers would refuse to leave their quarters. Others would attack their own comrades, convinced they were human infiltrators. Some would just sit in corners, rocking back and forth, mumbling about ghosts. The young soldiers were no longer drinking. They were too terrified to move. The temperature control systems throughout the base began malfunctioning. But it wasn't random equipment failure. The humans were controlling them remotely, creating freezing conditions that reminded everyone of the bodies we kept finding. Bodies that had died of terror. Zexthari's voice became filled with desperation. After 3 months of this torment, General Kecksmith tried to contact the human ghosts. He broadcast messages throughout the moon offering to negotiate. For weeks, there was no response. Then, finally, Colonel Murphy answered. The old alien turned back to the soldiers. Murphy appeared on our communication screen like he had been waiting for us to call. He looked calm and relaxed, like he was having a pleasant conversation. He offered to end the haunting immediately if we would withdraw all coalition forces from Europa and never return. Zexthari's eyes were wild with fear. But then Murphy told us the truth that broke our minds completely. He said that everything we had experienced, all the terror, all the psychological warfare, all the impossible supernatural events, had been created by just 12 humans. The silence in the bar was so complete that it seemed like time had stopped. 12 humans had terrorized 50,000 coalition troops. 12 humans had turned an entire moon into a weapon of fear. 12 humans had made the finest military force in the galaxy beg for mercy. Zexthari returned to his seat, his entire body shaking. Murphy explained that they had been using the moon's own environment against us. The tunnel systems, the temperature controls, the communication networks, everything had been turned into tools of psychological warfare. They had made us afraid of the very air we breathed. The old alien finished his drink in one gulp. The coalition fleet withdrew immediately. We left Europa to the ghosts who had claimed it, but the damage was already done. Word spread throughout the coalition military about what had happened. Soldiers began to fear not just fighting humans, but being stationed anywhere near human. Space, Zexthari prepared to leave. Europa is still inhabited by humans today. But coalition ships avoid that entire star system. We learned that humans don't just fight with weapons or technology. They fight with fear itself. They can turn your own mind into their weapon. As the old alien walked toward the door, he paused. One final time. The most terrifying thing about Europa was not what the humans did to us. It was how easy it was for them. 12 soldiers with no special equipment or advanced technology had defeated 50,000 of our best troops. They had proven that humans could wage war with nothing but their understanding of fear. Zexthari disappeared into the night, leaving the young soldiers alone with their terror. They had learned that humans were not just physically dangerous. They were psychologically devastating. They could reach into your mind and turn your own fears against you. The humans had shown the coalition that they didn't need superior numbers or better weapons to win. They just needed to understand their enemies well enough to destroy them from the inside. On the 5th night, the young soldiers found Zexthari sitting in complete darkness at his table. He had not ordered any drinks, he had not spoken to anyone. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. Are you ready for the final story? He asked without looking at them. This is the one that ended the war. This is the story that made the coalition surrender to a species we had thought we could easily defeat. The soldiers sat down reluctantly. They were not sure they wanted to hear anymore. After Europa, the coalition leadership made a desperate decision. They decided to end the war by destroying Earth itself. They gathered every ship that could still fly, every soldier who could still fight, the largest fleet in galactic history. Zexthari's voice was completely emotionless. 5,000 ships, 2 million troops, every weapon we had ever developed. We came to the human home system to finish what we had started. We came to commit genocide. The young soldiers felt sick just hearing the numbers. Earth was defended by an admiral named Jack Harrison. He was an old human, maybe 70 years. He had fought in every major battle of the war. When our massive fleet arrived at Earth, he didn't try to negotiate. He didn't ask for mercy. He just activated humanity's final weapon. Zexthari finally looked up at the soldiers with dead eyes. The weapon was not a bomb or a gun or a ship. The weapon was humanity itself. Harrison had gathered every human who had died in the war and turned their memories into a weapon of mass destruction. The soldiers looked confused. How do you turn memories into weapons? There was a human scientist named Paul Kim who had been working on this project throughout the entire war. He had found a way to record human thoughts and emotions. Then he found a way to transmit those thoughts directly into the minds of other species. Zexthree's viz became filled with horror. Kim had collected the final moments of every human who had died fighting the Coalition. The miners from the asteroid colony, the defenders of New Geneva, the berserker pilots from Proxima Station, the ghosts from Europa, all of them. The old alien stood up and began pacing again. The human fleet was led by a captain named Rose Martinez. She commanded a squadron of volunteer pilots in ships that had been modified to carry Kim's weapon. These ships were designed to transmit the memories of dead humans directly into our minds. Zexthree stopped pacing and stared directly at the young soldiers. When the battle began, we expected to face the usual human tactics: suicide attacks, psychological warfare, impossible maneuvers. Instead, we found ourselves fighting the accumulated rage and pain of an entire species. The bar had become so quiet that the soldiers could hear their own heartbeats. Martinez's squadron flew directly into our fleet, but instead of attacking our ships, they attacked our minds. Every Coalition soldier suddenly experienced the death of Jake Morrison as he defended the mining colony. We felt his determination, his courage, his refusal to surrender. Zexthree's voice cracked with emotion. But that was just the beginning. We also experienced the deaths of Lisa Grant as she flew her ship into our cruiser. We felt her laughter as she chose to die fighting. We experienced the slow poisoning of the defenders of New Geneva. We felt their pain as they died protecting their world. The old alien's eyes filled with tears. The berserker pilots were the worst. We experienced Carl Anderson's joy as he flew to his death. We felt the pure happiness he experienced as he crashed into our command ship. We understood for the first time why he was smiling. Zexthree sat back down heavily. But Kim's weapon didn't just show us how humans died, it showed us why they died. We experienced their love for their families, their loyalty to their friends, their determination to protect their homes. We felt what it meant to be human. The young soldiers were starting to understand the true horror of what they were hearing. For the first time in the war, Coalition soldiers understood the human perspective. We realized that every human we had killed had been someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. We understood that they had not been fighting because they were violent or cruel. They had been fighting because they loved something more than they feared death. Zexthree's voice became barely audible. The psychological assault was so intense that entire Coalition ships began to shut down. Crews were collapsing under the weight of human emotion. Soldiers were experiencing the grief of human parents who had lost children, the rage of human children who had lost parents. The old alien looked up at the ceiling. My own ship was affected. I found myself experiencing the memories of a human mother who had died defending her baby during the siege of New Geneva. I felt her desperation, her fear, her absolute determination to protect her child, even if it meant her own death. Zexthree's claws dug into the table. But the worst part was understanding their perspective on us. Through the human memories, we saw ourselves as the humans saw us. We were not noble warriors fighting for the Coalition. We were invaders, murderers, destroyers of families and homes. The silence in the bar was so complete that it seemed like the entire universe had stopped. Many Coalition soldiers began to refuse orders. They could not continue fighting after experiencing human love and human loss. Some turned their weapons on themselves rather than continue the war. Others simply abandoned their posts and fled. Zexthree stood up again and walked to the window. But Admiral Harrison had one more surprise for us. He had rigged Earth itself with weapons that would destroy both the planet and our entire fleet. The message was clear. If we destroyed humanity, we would die alongside them. The old alien's voice became filled with despair. Harrison's final transmission explained that humans would rather see their own species extinct than live as slaves. He said that if the Coalition wanted to rule human space, they would rule over nothing but empty worlds and dead systems. Zexthree turned back to the soldiers. The Coalition fleet began to retreat immediately, but Harrison sent one final wave of transmissions. Every Coalition soldier experienced the collective memory of humanity's entire history. We saw their wars, their art, their music, their love. We understood that we were not just fighting another species. We were fighting the accumulated dreams and hopes of billions of souls. The old alien returned to his seat. The war ended that day, not because humans surrendered, but because the Coalition could not continue fighting. We had learned what it meant to be human, and we could not bring ourselves to destroy something so beautiful and terrible. Zexthury looked directly at each of the young soldiers. The most horrifying thing about the final battle was not the weapon itself. It was the realization that humans had been holding back throughout the entire war. Everything they had shown us, the suicide attacks, the psychological warfare, the berserker protocols, all of it had been restrained. The old alien's voice dropped to a whisper. Harrison's final message revealed the truth. He said that what the Coalition had experienced was not human warfare at its peak. He said that humans had another word for what they did when they stopped holding back completely. They called it extinction. Zexthury prepared to leave for the final time. The Coalition still monitors human space today, not because we plan to attack them again, but because we need to make sure they never decide to attack us. We learned that there are some species in the universe that are too dangerous to fight, too determined to break, and too alien in their thinking to ever truly understand. The old alien walked toward the door. Humans are not the strongest species. In the galaxy, they are not the smartest or the most advanced. But they are something much more terrifying. They are absolutely, completely, and utterly undefeatable because they would rather die than submit. As Zexthury disappeared into the night for the last time, the young soldiers sat in stunned silence. They had learned the ultimate lesson about humanity. Humans were not just another species to be conquered or avoided. They were a force of nature, as inevitable and unstoppable as the stars. Themselves, the humans had proven that some battles could only be won by being willing to lose everything. They had shown the galaxy that there were fates worse than death, and slavery was one of them. Most terrifyingly of all, they had demonstrated that love could be the most devastating weapon of all when wielded by those who had nothing left to lose.